All right, I got the go ahead to start, so turn this down a little bit. All right, welcome to Living the Linux Life. I'm Lim Yu, and I'm the Windows and Linux framework architect here at Xojo. And we'll be talking about Linux today and how you can live the Linux life. All right, let's not lie to ourselves. Linux is complex, so if you want to live the Linux life, you're going to live a complex life. If you can see here, we got just a smidgen of all the distros that are available for download. So the popular ones are Mint, Ubuntu, Fedora, and even those have variants for download. So Ubuntu has Kubuntu, Mint has Cinnamon, Mint Mate, Mint KDE. So a very complicated life that you'll have to live if you want to live the Linux life. So let's talk about the layers of Linux. Basically, all Linux distros start with the kernel. This is the heart of the system, provides the low-level APIs to the hardware. On top of that, call this the display server level. This is the low-level GUI layer. There's X11, the X server. There's also Wayland is becoming more popular. And you might hear mention of Mir, which is used on Ubuntu as well. On top of that layer, there's window managers. And this layer controls the Windows theme decorations. So the title bar or the caption on the window, how the buttons look on that window. Some of the popular Windows managers are, there used to be MetaCity, was very popular, but now that other more popular ones have come out, like XFCE, it's been there for a while. There's Mutter, all sorts of different window managers. And on top of that, we have the toolkit libraries. And these are the libraries that provide the API to create buttons and all those UI elements in your app. And on top of that, we have the desktop environment. And the two most popular ones are GNOME and KDE. Probably heard of those. They provide controls to the file system. Pretty much it puts it all together. And after that, there's also package managers. This really differentiates the distros. So this layer provides the installation and software update layer. The two popular ones are RPM and Debian. And these distros are based off of these package managers. So like Ubuntu, it's Debian based. We got Fedora, which is Red Hat, RPM based. I believe CentOS is also RPM based. So when you think of a Linux distro, the two main ones that I think about are RPM based Linux distros and Debian based Linux distros. Let's take a deep dive into some of these distros. First, let's look at Mint. It's Debian based. They provide different desktop managers depending on what distro you download from them. Cinnamon is popular. It's based off of GNOME. There's also KDE, which I believe they've announced that they're going to drop support for that, but it's still available. They also have the Mate desktop manager as well. I believe that is also based off of GNOME. And their window manager is based off of Muffin, which is a derivative of Mutter, which I believe originated through MetaCity. So it's complicated I guess, ladder of window managers. And their display server is driven by X11. So that's Mint. So let's talk about Ubuntu. Ubuntu is Debian-based. The primary desktop managers are GNOME and KDE. If you want the KDE desktop manager, you download KUbuntu. Its window manager is based off of Mutter. And they've recently switched to the Wayland display server. Wayland is supposedly the successor to X, but the adoption has been a little slow. Wayland is based off the OpenGLES API, so it should be faster. It should support fractional DPI scales, and it's being used by more distros for sure. Next, let's look at Fedora. Fedora is RPM based. The desktop manager that I found the download for was GNOME. I don't know if they offer a KDE version. They might. The window manager, again, Mutter is popular. They use that, and their display server is also using Wayland. So with all these Linux distros, how are they even closely running the same things? Well, there's this website called freedesktop.org, which provides a lot of the open standards that all the distros should adopt, such as the drag and drop protocols, what MIME types, and what menu categories you see on the start menu. And on that site, there's references to the X server documentation, how that should work, and also the Wayland display server as well. And also a link to the standard Linux base. And this describes the minimum set of APIs that a distro should support. So most distros will have at least a minimum set of, hey, I support GTK3, and this is what I support. So what about Xojo and Linux? So when we were thinking about UI toolkits, we had two options. We had option of going with GTK or the option of going with Qt. Now, GTK was at the time not as well developed as Qt was. And we really wanted to go with Qt. But the main difference was that GTK was free. And if we went with Qt, we had to pay a royalty. You guys would probably have to pay a royalty. And it was just a mess. So that is why your Linux apps are GTK-based apps. So recently, last year, we upgraded our framework on Linux to use GTK3 since 2017 R2. Before we used GTK version 2. In this release, we've added the requirement to libunwind 8, but only for 64-bit and Pi apps. Console apps have slightly lower requirements, mainly because they don't need any GUI libraries. And we built them off of a lower set of required libraries. If you're playing sounds or movies in your application, we're using libgstreamer. So if your end user does not have libgstreamer installed, that will be a problem, but most people do. The HTML viewer that we use is based off of libwebkit 3. And the version is very important, so libwebkit GTK1 would not work, or 4 would not work either. We also support Pi, and we recently updated the requirements that we support Jesse or later. We've dropped support for, I believe it was Wheezy.
What's Pi?
What's Pi? Raspberry Pi?
Just small, $55
Right,
CPU.
okay.
Yes.
That's awesome.
Yep. All right, so let's take a look at some GK3 features. With the transition from GK3, we've been able to support HiDPI right off the bat. GK3 supports it. Now, some Linux distros support fractional scale, but since GDK does not support fractional HiDPI, the only thing you'll see scaled is the text. We've recently tweaked our framework to support Wayland and mirror backends. GDK3 introduced the ability to customize and style your controls through CSS. We'll go through some examples of how you do that. And they actually made it easier to determine the natural control sizes. We'll compare how GK2 determined that size and how much easier it is in GK3. Also a nice change in GK3, we're now able to support clipping to a non-transparent container. This was not working in GK2. And now that GK3 renders all in Cairo, the rect control draw into now works as you see it on screen. So what you see is what you get. Before, with GK2, we were actually drawing and theming the controls ourselves. So let's take a look at how we style with GK3. As I mentioned, this is customizable with CSS. So if you're familiar with CSS and how that works, you can style all your controls using this one file that lives in your home directory. It's very specific, has to live in this specific file in this folder. And this modifies the style of all your apps. If you don't want to do that, you can use this GDK style context, which every GK widget supports. And that allows you to programmatically style all or just a single instance of your control. So let's go ahead and take a look at some demos here. All right, so the first demo I want to show you is how do you turn on HiDPI. Some of you may not know how to do that in your Linux distro. In this particular distro, you can find it in Preferences and General. And they call it User Interface Scaling here. By default, it's just auto. But here I can enable HiDPI. And you'll notice it's really big, but it scales properly. Now I have an example of what that looked like with GDK2 and how it didn't support HiDPI. So let's take a look at that. So here's a GDK2 app built with 2017 R1. If I turn on HiDPI, looks terrible, huh? The controls in scale, but the text scale. And that's a terrible looking interface, obviously. And so with GK3, it scales properly, and you get a nice HiDPI interface. All right, let's turn that back off. All right, so that was demonstrating HiDPI with GK3. Now let's take a look at styling. So as I mentioned, to style control, you pretty much just use CSS to style things. And here I've got an example with some buttons that I want to change the background color of. And since we don't have a background color property, you can't do that natively here on our interface. But I've added some code here that simply accesses the GTK style context I was talking about. So as I mentioned, every widget has a style context. And so I created some declares, and I'm pretty much gonna style the background. And the interesting thing to note about CSS is that some things have higher priority. So if you have a background image, that has precedence over the background color. So in this case, I am setting the image to none to make sure there's nothing there. And I'm just gonna adjust the color. All right, let's see how that looks. So on the left-hand side, I just create a solid color for that. But on the right-hand side, if you know CSS, you can do gradients. And so that's all I did. I created a gradient. And so that's how you can style your controls. Now, as I mentioned, there's a file in your system that can be used to style all your GTK apps. And I create a simple demonstration of this. So I'm going to move this back into its right name. And I'll show you what this piece of code is doing. It's pretty much just saying the opacity of these buttons. A simple demonstration to show you that this will actually affect your entire application. So let's quit this. And let's go ahead and run this again and see how it looks with that opacity set. Yeah, you probably don't want that, but it's an example of how people, users, can completely theme your app however they like. And this is one way. If you really don't like the default look of your GTK app, you can do that. All right, so for our sake, let's delete this file. Okay. Let's take a look at that container control issue, or like a control issue with clipping. As I mentioned before, in GK2, we didn't really support child controls on a container, transparent container, because the child control didn't clip. So let's take a look at how it looked in GK2 first. Okay. So as you can tell, one of these canvases is transparent and the other one's not. So this one is not transparent. And so what you'll see here, because of how GK2 worked, is that where the canvas is really using the context of the window to what's the word I'm looking for, to make it look transparent. So it's really just drawing onto the window. And so because it's doing that, it's not a real control. It doesn't clip that button. But once it is non-transparent, that becomes a window that does clip child controls. So that's how it worked in GK2. Let's see how that looks in GK3. Of course, I ran the wrong one. Okay. As you can see, they're both transparent. Even the even the non-transparent control. And they both clip just fine. Okay, any questions on those examples? Anything I didn't elaborate on? Okay. All right. So let's talk about some of the Linux best practices. One of the major issues on Linux is control sizes. As you know, with all the different distros out there, different window managers, themes, control sizes is going to be an issue. On one distro, it might look just fine, but then you run it on a different distro and you get clip text because the button is not big enough. So in GTK 2, to solve that, we had to go through a bunch of declares, and we had to wait for the right moment in time that GTK knows of the padding and everything to know the size of control. And it was annoying to the extent that not a lot of people bothered to do it. Well, with GTK 3, it's a simple API call. You can call it anywhere pretty much, and it'll just work. And we'll take a look at how to do that in a minute. One thing to note about GNOME and KDE, those two competing desktops have slightly different UI layouts. GNOME is more OS X based, where the action button should be on the right-hand side, while KDE is more Windows based and the button should be on the left-hand side. Action button should be on the left-hand side. Well, GTK 2 had this nice feature called the GTK alternate button order function call that you could use to figure that out. However, for some reason, they deprecated that. Almost like they didn't want people to make it look more KDE. They just wanted it to look more like GNOME. Don't know why they did that, but this call that worked before is no longer available, unfortunately. So one of the things that people come to us and ask us about is adding your app to the start menu. And it's actually not a difficult process. When you build your app, we take these size icons that you've added to your app and we spit out a PNG in the directory of your executable. Now these icons are useful to add your app to the start menu. You'll need to create a .desktop file. This is a special file you'll put in a special directory. We'll go through how to do that in a minute. And you need to use the registered categories. As explained, Linux standards can be found on freedesktop.org. And one of the specs are what categories you can register. And so this link here can show you the sanctioned categories that you can use. So here we've added, if you installed Xojo via the Debian package, it should install this item in your start menu. We've registered Xojo to install in the programming category, and nicely they added a nice icon for us. But if your category is not listed, I don't believe you'll have a nice picture of anything. So definitely use the correct register categories when you add your app. And here's how to do it. If you can see, there's a special desktop folder. You can name it anything you want, really, but it has to end with .desktop, I believe. And this lives in your user share applications folder. And here's just an example of what the Xojo desktop file looks like. The most important bits are the name, how you execute it, where the executable is, and the icon. And of course, the category where this lives. All right, let's take a look at some demos here. So I wanted to look at first how we figure out the link's default control size with GK2. As I mentioned, this was a lot of work because GDK didn't know the size, the minimum size of the control until a certain point in time. So what you had to do was you had to connect a signal handler to the size allocate signal. And until you receive that signal, you couldn't probe its size because it didn't know what the size should be. And in the size allocate callback, I called a function which got the size. So and that's how that's done in GK2. So let's go ahead and take a look at how it's done in GK3. It's much easier. It's one simple declare. It's one simple declare to get the height, or if you wanted to get the width too, you can add a declare for that. But here I'm just gonna set the button's height and width to compare and contrast at how the other button looks without being correctly sized. So this button is correctly sized because we set it up properly. And this button, as you can see, could use a little more padding on the bottom. So yeah, the two APIs to look at are GK widget get preferred height. And on occasion, you'll probably also want to get the preferred width as well. And you can just grab its natural height and width. All right, let's take a look at how we add our app to the start menu. So as I mentioned, Xojo is installed with a Debian package. You don't need to have a Debian package to add your app to the start menu. You just need to create that desktop file. So let's go ahead and take a look at how that's done. I prepared a desktop file already. I called it smile. So I'm simply going to move that so it has the correct name, of course. All right, let's take a look at what that looks like. So really it's not a long file. The most important bits are the name. You can add a comment, where the executable lives, and of course the icon. And those are the PNG files that the IDE spits out. You can use one of those as your icon. And then down here is your category. And those are all the supported categories. So if one didn't exist for that distro, it'll move on to the next one. If that didn't exist, it'll move on to the next one. They'll try and find a category that actually exists. So in our case, development didn't exist, but programming did. Okay, so once that's done, your icon magically appears in the Start menu. Click on it, your app appears. And what normally you'd want to upload or create a Debian package, and this would be part of your package, and it would install just naturally with the Debian installer. Okay. Question? Yes.
Is there any way to make the path to the executable relative versus absolute?
Question is, there's a way to make the path to executable relative instead of absolute. I do not know.
Yeah, I looked for it too, and
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I do not know. Is there a reason you would make it relative
More portable.
or portable?
Or it can tilde / for the users. And I tried that last night. Didn't like that. I had to have a full absolute path. So.
Yeah. So Justin mentioned that he had to have a full absolute path and that the tilde didn't work. So
Maybe there's some other way. So I just started looking. Maybe there's another way to do it.
perhaps there's another way to do it. Perhaps not, but that's at least someone tried it. Okay. All right. Let's go back to the slides. All right, finally, just some tips. Preferences, on the Mac, you store in plist, in Windows, registry. On Linux, you can store it in Etsy if you want all your users to access that preference, or you can install it somewhere in their home directory. And typically, you want to prefix it with a dot or period, because that hides it. Just a quick mention about the clipboard. Clipboard in Linux, if you're getting any data, this actually requires an entry into the event loop. So if you're trying to get the text of a clipboard, your timer action might fire in between. So make note of that. Ubuntu, very special Linux distro, has a lot of Ubuntu specific features. One feature is their global menu. And clicking on this menu will actually deactivate your app.
Quick question, real quick. Can you pause for 30 seconds while I put a new card in?
Bet.
I am so sorry about this, but somehow in the middle of your presentation, the card filled up and stopped recording. So,
Excellent.
right in the middle, we'll talk after about what I'll need to do with your computer. I'll just need to run through the slides.
Okay, no problem.
Quick, but give me 30 seconds so that I can record onto this card. I am so sorry about that. All right, you're good. Go
All right.
ahead.
So clicking on the global menu on Ubuntu will deactivate your app. If you have any special code in your deactivate event, that might fire unexpectedly. So you need to make note of that as well. If you're testing on Ubuntu and you just want to turn that off, that global menu, you can with the environment variable. Set that to 0, you run your app, and the menu bar should present itself in your application instead. Also, there's an overlay scroll bar feature in Ubuntu. You can also turn this off if you're testing. You want to see how it looks on other distros. You can also add an environment variable to turn that off. All right, any questions about living the Linux life? Yes, Carol.
We had a client ask us about using an ASUS Tinkerboard. Are you familiar at all with that?
Am I familiar with the ASUS Tinkerboard?
Yeah, they wanted to run Xojo on it.
I am not familiar with that.
Okay.
Anyone else familiar with that? Justin?
I bought one. It looked
Kind of where this guy was
right.
at.
It looks great because I want to do the exact same thing. It might. I hadn't had a chance to test on it yet, but the powerful, it has a much better GPU and everything else, and the price was not too bad, so I was gonna ask William the same question.
And what's it run?
They have their own distro right now, there are some other images out there,
Oh.
but Asus has a specialized one. Unfortunately, I don't remember what it's based on, it might be Ubuntu based, I think.
I think so.
Um, yeah, it would,
x86 or
no,
is it ARM?
it's still ARM, yeah, it's ARM, but it has a closed GPU, so that's why it's faster but not as open.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? Travis,
Are those declare examples that you ran through available somewhere for people to get?
are those declare examples available for someone to get? I believe they're attached to the slides that Dana sends out.
Excellent.
Oh, yes. Let's go back there first.
Do you plan to support ARM 64-bit?
Do we plan to support ARM 64-bit? It's an important feature, yes.
Is it a priority?
Is it a priority? Let's see if Travis nods his head.
Sorry for the weekend. Is it important?
Well, we do obviously support 64-bit ARM through iOS, and so bringing that over to Linux is something that we're considering.
So it's something we're considering. All right, there's that. Gino?
Few years ago, I heard you say something about the timers on Linux that were different than on Windows and on Mac. Is that still the case?
Question is, are timers different on Linux compared with Windows and the Mac? Answer is no, should be the same. Jared?
I'm just curious, what flavor of Linux would you recommend for someone who's new to it and would like something familiar and fairly easy?
All right, so good question. So what would I recommend as a good Linux distro? And Robin has answered for me. Mint 18.3. And yes, the distro I was running is Mint 18.3 Cinnamon. So
The reason for that is that Xojo apps run pretty much straight out of the box. You don't have to install any kind of cookie.
yes, even 32-bit Linux apps that you build will run straight up. Yep. All right, I think Justin had a question.
I've got a million thoughts here, but going back to Carol's question about the Raspberry Pi and Asus, if they're not happy with the Raspberry Pi, they probably just want GPU. But otherwise, I've been running it actually for digital signage for our conferences at Penn State. I now have 20 of them, and they're running fantastically, very solid. So the only need for the Asus ThinkBoard is if you want to have like 4K video, I think, in my opinion. So hopefully it's that. But but the ARM 64-bit, I was curious about that too. But Raspbian, I think, is still at 32-bit, even though the processor is 64-bit.
That's correct.
But so I don't know if you guys are probably. I mean, it probably doesn't make sense to move to 64-bit anyway until their base OS is 64-bit also.
Yes, 64-bit ARM, definitely important. But right now, probably not a priority because of that.
Yeah.
Any other questions? You guys feel comfortable living the Linux life?
Well, I learned that you can use CSS. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if something we don't support, you want to color your buttons, for example, or remove the borders, you can do that straight through CSS. And the examples that I've shown you should be available with the slides that Dana sent out.
The declares will definitely be helpful too, because I had ugly UI problems between when I took it from Mac OS to Raspbian. And
Yes, it's almost
that would be helpful to have, yeah.
it's almost guaranteed that you'll want to use those preferred height and preferred width on Linux.
So to that point, do you guys anticipate adding any type of APIs for Linux specifically?
Well, once we come out with auto layout, these APIs should be
Okay.
non-issue, right?
Okay.
So that's our plan.
Okay. Thanks.
All right, if there's no more other questions, thank you very much.